Another year rife in uncertainties and price volatility has passed for the energy, raw materials, and other commodities markets. Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022 has had a major impact on the prices of key commodities from oil and gas through to steel and grains across the world. The Ukraine war triggered an unprecedented wave of sanctions against Moscow, which are still rippling through global commodity markets. But the story was somewhat of a mixed bag here on the continent. The current commodity price boom affected Africa's commodity exporters and importers differently. The exporters benefited from a marked improvement, in their terms of trade, while importers, commodity importers, are still feeling the pain of higher imported energy and food prices. Africa's largest economy has faced a number of issues that will keep commodity prices at historically high levels, and concerns of an impending food crisis and global recession are added to that. How much of the challenges Nigeria faced in 2022 have spilled over into 2023? Nigeria's leading commodities market player, AFEX, has released its outlook for 2023. Joining me now is David Ibidapo, Head Market Data and Research at AFEX, and we'll get into Nigeria's commodity situation. David, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Tolulope. I'm glad to be here.
So in terms of how things played out for Nigeria, particularly in 2022, take us through the main commodities that AFEX seem to have basically researched and followed and tracked. And in terms of their performance, let's get into that as we get into the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Tolulope, for that question. So at AFEX, we take a look at a number of commodities. So we took a look at some grain commodities, which we believe are actually very key staples for the Nigerian, for the average household, right? And that's ranging from maize, paddy rice, sorghum, soybean. And we also took a look at some export commodities, which we believe holds a lot of key potentials to help Nigeria diversify its revenue base, and that's commodities like cocoa, ginger, cashew nut, and sesame, right? So those were the commodities that we actually focused on last year. And on the back of that, we run some level of survey and market research and insight just to be able to bring some level of predictions across production levels and also across price movement, right? If you look at the last 3 seasons, one of the things that you would actually find out is that commodities prices, especially grains and even export commodities, right, have always registered new historical highs on every season, right? And it is something that threatens food security, right? Because so if you let me just throw out some numbers. So if you look at maize, for example, in 2021 season, maize started at around 179,000 per metric ton. But in last season, which was 2022 season, it started at around 205,000 naira per metric ton, right? This represents like a 14% increase year on year. If you look at soybean, it started last 2 seasons around 147,000 per metric ton. Last season, it started at around 386, right? This is over a 100% increase in terms of price movement year on year. Paddy rice started at around 183,000 naira per metric ton last 2 seasons. But last season, it started at around 240,000 naira per metric ton. This represents around 60% increase, right? We see sorghum. We see sorghum starting at around 150,000 last 2 seasons, and starting at around 222 last season, right? And this represents around 48% increase. So one of the things we've been able to ascertain year in year out is that every season we've seen commodities prices register new historical highs, and we're also seeing that might be the play in this new season.
Okay, I'm interested in knowing, because when you say you're tracking it and every season we're seeing new historical highs, does this also predate Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Because that seemed to have jumped the line by several places. So were we seeing this trend also being in play before the invasion, or is it something that became more magnified because of the invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, so one thing you should understand is that in the Nigerian agricultural space, there are some structural challenges that currently affect, and always historically affected the commodity space, and has always formed the fundamentals for price pressures across commodities, right? yes, the Russia-Ukraine crisis came and worsened the outlook, right, for commodities because so Russia-Ukraine crisis started February 2022, right? We didn't really see the effect of that on commodities prices at farm gate level, and that's because typically the season starts from around October, right? And we would have seen a lot of buy purchase from big processors even between November, December, January, right? So we didn't really see that effect of the Russia-Ukraine crisis at farm gate level around February, right? Instead, we're seeing prices in the second quarter of the year reduce. However, we saw this translate into prices at the fork level, right? Because of higher diesel prices and the likes, right? So now we are seeing now that there are some structural challenges that has always affected and formed the fundamental basis for price pressures on commodities in Nigeria. And the Russia-Ukraine crisis is only worsening the outlook for commodities prices, right? Because now one of the pass-through to the effect of the Russia-Ukraine crisis is the high fertilizer prices, right?
Yes.
And we know that historically, farmers consume less fertilizers when fertilizer prices are actually high, right? So we've seen historically for periods that fertilizer prices increases significantly, there's always a significant reduction in fertilizer consumption, right? And we understand the planting season of Nigeria, right? So this last year during our crop production survey, which we also published at AFEX, one of the things we were able to ascertain was that farmers utilized lesser fertilizer for the planting season last year, and that shaped majorly our outlook for production levels for these commodities, right? And on the back, and we understand simple demand and supply, right? Where supply levels are not able to meet demand levels,
Yes.
we're already looking at potential price pressures on commodities. That's what forms our outlook.
So you've mentioned the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which many people now recognize as being just another part for many African countries of the struggle and the structural challenges, and then the structural challenges that have been quite long-standing. But beyond that, in 2022, particularly for food prices, and we saw historically high food inflation, when it comes to that, what other factors drove the increase in price for Nigeria?
Okay, so in the last 2 to 3 years, thereabout, we started seeing a trend around shrinking food balances across these commodities, right? And what does that simply mean? It means year in, year out, right? We've seen consumption levels for this commodity outpace production levels, right? So there are some years that we recorded growth in production levels, but when you compare that growth rate to consumption levels growth rate, right? You see that consumption levels actually outpaces production levels. And the implication of that is simple, right? It means there's a lot of demand for our commodities and we're not meeting that rising demand levels, right? So that is, like I said, it's a fundamental driver of prices, right? Last year, we also saw the impact of higher energy price. Within a year, we saw energy prices, diesel prices increased by over 300%, right? Now, the implication of that is that we saw a translatory effect on fork level. Like I said earlier, during the second half of the year, we saw prices moderate across a number of key staples like maize, soybean, paddy rice in the second half of the year 2022. But then that didn't translate into reduction in price levels at the fork level. And why is that? Because we also know that one of the key factors is actually our logistics, right? So most of the vehicles that convey these commodities from the production areas to the consumption areas actually rely on diesel to function, to operate. And if diesel prices have increased by over 300%, it means that cost will also be passed down to the final consumer, right? That is why we are seeing a lot of pressure on food inflation, right? And another major factor that also drove prices, that have always driven prices in the last couple of years, is also the expansion of the capacity of large processors, right? So over the years, we've seen large processors actually increase their capacity, millers increase their capacity, and that automatically means more demand. And that's why we are seeing a very fast-paced consumption level, right? Outpacing production levels for these commodities.
Okay.
And that's just to mention a few.
Okay, so something I found interesting in the reports is that it also shows that Nigeria's agricultural sector actually showed some resilience. It outperformed most sectors, including trade, oil and gas, telecoms, and even manufacturing, contributing 27.6% to Nigeria's GDP in Q3 of 2022, which is quite interesting. Nigeria's agricultural sector employs almost, I think, the largest amount of Nigerians, still remains quite informal rather than fully formalized and mechanized and, of course, technology advanced, but it's still contributing. So in terms of how it could deliver so much in a year that was so difficult, fertilizer was a major part of that equation as well. What could account for the performance that we saw for agriculture?
Yeah, you're very right. The Nigerian agricultural sector has remained resilient. And if you look at the performance of this sector over the years, you see that for even years that we saw Nigeria dip into recession, right, that sector still grew, right? The growth, however, is snail pace. It's around averaging 1 to 2%, right? However, it's still growing. Now, one of the major drivers, right? Look at the composition of GDP. Typically, we have the consumption C plus I plus G X minus M, right? Consumption actually largely accounts for about 70% of the GDP, right? And so the question you should ask yourself is, what do households really consume? What do they purchase, right? So even in a recessionary economy, even in an economy that's slowing, right, households will still eat, right? They will still purchase commodities, they will still purchase food to eat, right? So a large chunk of their income will still go into purchase of food items, right? And that's one of the major drivers of the agriculture sector over the years, right? And that's why we've seen that level of resilience, right? And also, we understand that the crop production subsector of the agricultural sector actually accounts for over 90% of the performance of the agricultural sector, right? And one of the major one aspect that Nigeria has comparative advantage, right, is actually in crop production. So you see a lot of farmers go into farming, right, and it's every year, right. There's no single year that we don't see farmers go to farms to farm, right, and there's always that level of transaction between the farmers, the traders, and also processors. And GDP typically measures business activities, right, and that's why we are seeing that level of resilience in the agricultural sector. I would think that sector holds the key to diversify Nigeria's revenue base.
Interesting you say that, because my next question takes us back to the fertilizer conversation, because with that, you're also predicting a 12% decline, particularly for fertilizer this year, as we continue to see the supply disruptions eventually sort of resume, gradually stabilize in a way. But that 12% decline is something that's going to hit many importers like Nigeria and other African economies particularly hard. What are the risks that we have when it comes to this prediction?
Okay, so our prediction for production last year was that across major staples, we will see at least 12% decline in production levels, right, except for soybean. And that's because due to the invasion of Russia and invasion of Ukraine by Russia, right, we saw some level of supply disruptions for fertilizer. So we understand that Russia and Ukraine are actually one of the biggest producers of nitrogen-based fertilizer. And even as a matter of fact, right, Nigeria is largely dependent on importing some of the components of fertilizer, NP and K, right, for the production activities. Also, we didn't see so prices were already high. Fertilizer prices rose by about almost 30%, right, in the first half of the year, right? And that reduced the consumption of fertilizer by farmers. Right? So on the back of that, we are predicting some level of decline in staples in terms of production levels, right? However, we started seeing fertilizer prices decline, moderate, right? However, but the price at which fertilizer is still higher than levels we saw in previous years, right? And this cause for worry. And why is that? Because now we still have the Russia-Ukraine crisis still looming, right? No one knows to what end, or no one knows when this is going to actually stop, or whether there will be further disruptions in the Black Sea region, right? And also disruption in fertilizer supply, right? So this is actually a big risk. And we think even some form of respite that we are getting that we will get from the dry season harvest, right? We may not see that, right? And it's also largely dependent because during dry season harvest, you typically see farmers use much more fertilizer than necessary because it is dry season, right? So there are a lot of risks to production levels this season, and also an upside risk to prices for commodities this season.
Okay, so as we move this ahead to the conclusion, we have these inflationary pressures that you've mentioned. Many of them, some of them, not all, but some of them quite being external pressures that economies like Nigeria and around the continent are feeling. But we're seeing weakening currencies. We're seeing commodities also continue to fluctuate. And some of these have recent drops, and they've given some questions as to what's going to happen in the long term. How long do you think these inflationary pressures in countries like Nigeria that have these similar sort of circumstances happening around them will continue to last into 2023?
Okay, so I think one of the things you would agree with me is the fact that Nigeria's economy is I would define it as a stagflated economy, right? So what do I mean by that? It's a situation where typically we are seeing pressures, inflation rates are rising, GDP rate is slowing, right? Unemployment rate is increasing and the likes, right? Now, though in the global space, the outlook for the global space is that because of the slowing down of the global economy, right, and also a possible recession, right, we may see some level of moderation in global commodities prices, right, and that's due to the fact that we'll see some level of low demand for commodities, which would actually reduce the pressure on prices and moderate prices, right. However, we are not seeing this. We may not see this impact some economies like Nigeria, developing economies like Nigeria, and that's really because of the pass-through from the FX side, right? Now, we've been able to ascertain a very strong correlation between the FX market movement and also commodity price, and that's about 0.9. And 90% of the time, there's always that translatory effect from FX. So if your currency keeps weakening, the resultant effect is that we see price pressures on commodities, right? So that's a very big pass through, right? And also we should understand that an economy like Nigeria still has some fundamental structures, some fundamental challenges that are yet to be addressed. Now, for example, right, even if the outlook is that we are going to see what they call it, a slowdown in global growth, right, and also a slowdown in Nigeria's GDP, right, which should typically tame inflationary pressure, right. Last season, because of the type of cultivation we do, right, what we produced last season is typically what we would have to leave for this new year, right? And we're already seeing a projection of a very significant decline across commodities.
Yes.
Right? So what that means is that there are still some underlying factors that will weigh on the possibility of a moderation in prices for commodities, right? And that's a very big one. And also, we still have issues around post-harvest loss. Now, Nigeria it's estimated that Nigeria loses about 5 trillion annually, right, due to post-harvest loss. And this translates to about 50% of what is produced is lost, right, in a year. That is very significant. That is very, very huge. And that also explains the fact that it explains one of our challenges and the gap in infrastructure, right? So when we talk about storage, for example, right, Nigeria can only absorb 5% to 7% of what it produces annually in terms of the storage capacity. And that is very, very small, right? So we still need some level of huge investment in storage facilities. And that's why here at AFEX, one of our major solutions, one of our major solutions we bring to the table is actually the storage solution, right?
Okay.
We have a lot of warehouses across, we have over 130 warehouses across all the states in Nigeria, right? And that's because we understand that if you don't solve for storage, right, we won't be able to save as much, and a lot of our commodities would be highly susceptible to post-harvest losses, right? So all these structural challenges are yet to be fixed, right? Still plays a major role in determining price levels going forward, right?
Okay.
And we think this is a major outlook for the economy.
And really, that was where I was going to wrap things up because, of course, you've mentioned the global economic slowdown, concerns about a worldwide recession as well. And also, we've seen commodity prices, they're declining from their heights, but not as much or as quickly as many people would hope it to be. So specifically for Nigeria, you've started looking at it, you started answering the question around the projections, but I'll need this answer in just about 1 minute. Where do we think things will be? Where do we think things will settle for 2023 mainly? Of course, keeping in mind the Russia-Ukraine crisis is still on. The structural issues predate that and have been part of the issues for many, many years now. But when we're looking at some of the main commodities for Nigeria, what do we think 2023 will show?
Okay, so we think there will be some level of pressure on current supply of commodities. So like I said, so just to pick an example, so we have paddy rice, right, which we forecast to decline by 22%, and that's because on the back of a lot of farmers didn't plant that commodity last year, and also we had the flood incidents, right? Now that is actually a very huge decline. So imagine what the pressure would be in terms of price. So we are forecasting that for some commodity, for all commodities, right, we will see commodities register new historical highs, right? Though in terms of trade, it may temper a bit, it may slow a bit, right? But however, we still see that pressure on commodity prices. And also one of the major factors I think I need to make mention, right? Because even if we see some level of moderation or some level of slowing in terms of growth at farm gate levels, this may not necessarily translate into reduction in food prices at fork level, that's at consumption level. And why is that, right? That's because we still have high energy prices, right? And the outlook for that is that prices of diesel, right, of petrol will stay increased, right? And there's always that transitory effect on the final prices of commodities, right? So, and this is actually a big issue. So and I know the CBN is also worried about this, and that's why we've seen them take some hawkish stance to kind of temper inflationary pressure. And we may continue to see them take that stance in subsequent MPCs.
Okay. All right. David Bidapo from AFEX, thank you so much. We'll be watching things out. I know for many Nigerians, as you said earlier, the majority of their money goes to food costs, which means that we're spending a lot of money on some of these commodities, and any reduction, any increase in investments that will give us a positive return is something many of us will look for. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Tolu Lope.